A newborn's cry pierced the Wyoming dawn, barely audible over the approaching thunder of iron wheels on steel tracks. Caleb Turner's horse reared as he spotted the bundle, impossibly small, impossibly alone, lying between the railroad ties like discarded cargo. The note pinned to the filthy blanket contained just one word: unwanted. In 30 seconds, the 647 to Cheyenne would crush everything in its path. Caleb had 10 seconds to decide: ride on to the new life he'd planned, or sacrifice everything for a child the world had already thrown away. Stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The high plains of Colorado Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of golden grass broken only by the dark line of the railroad cutting through the wilderness like a scar. Caleb Turner had been riding since before dawn, his wagon loaded with everything he owned, which wasn't much: a bedroll, some tools, a month's worth of supplies, and a deed to 160 acres of government land that he'd never laid eyes on. At 32 years old, he was finally claiming something of his own. The morning of June 15th, 1878, should have been the beginning of his new life. Instead, it became the day everything changed. Caleb pulled his hat lower against the rising sun, his weathered face showing the years of hard living that had brought him to this moment. He'd worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, broken horses for the Army, and spent winters in mining camps that would have broken lesser men. Every dollar saved, every hardship endured had been for this, a chance to build something that belonged to him alone. His horse, a sturdy roan mare named Copper, suddenly threw her head up and sidled nervously. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to the rifle strapped to his saddle. Indians hadn't been trouble in this area for years, but a man alone in open country learned to trust his horse's instincts more than his own eyes. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint and unexpected that for a moment he thought he'd imagined it. A cry. Thin, desperate, utterly human. "Whoa, girl!" Caleb brought Copper to a halt, his eyes scanning the empty landscape. The railroad tracks lay about 50 yards to his left, running parallel to the wagon road he'd been following. Nothing moved except the grass bending in the wind. Then he heard it again, stronger this time, more insistent, the cry of an infant. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He urged Copper forward, leaving the wagon road and heading toward the tracks. As he drew closer, his eyes locked onto something that didn't belong in this desolate place: a bundle of cloth lying directly between the iron rails. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, swinging down from the saddle before Copper had fully stopped. The bundle was moving. Tiny fists pushed against stained fabric, and the crying grew louder as Caleb approached. His boots crunched on the gravel between the ties as he knelt down, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he pulled back the corner of what he now recognized as a blanket. A baby. A newborn, by the looks of it. Girl, he thought, though he'd never been around infants enough to be certain. Her face was red from crying, her body frighteningly small and fragile. And pinned to the blanket was a piece of paper, torn from what looked like a ledger book, with a single word written in crude letters: Unwanted. Caleb stared at the note, something cold and familiar settling in his chest. He knew that word. He'd carried it with him for 32 years, even though no one had ever written it down for him. The baby's cries intensified, pulling him from his thoughts. He reached for her, then hesitated. His hands were calloused and scarred, better suited to handling rope and leather than something so delicate. But the child was shivering despite the growing warmth of the morning, and her lips had a bluish tint that he instinctively knew was wrong. He was gathering the bundle into his arms when Copper whinnied sharply, her warning call. Caleb's head snapped up, and his blood turned to ice. In the distance, coming from the east, a dark plume of smoke rose against the pale sky. The train. The morning freight that ran from Denver to the mining camps in the mountains. He could just make out the black shape of the locomotive, maybe 2 miles away but closing fast. No, no, no! Caleb scooped the baby against his chest and ran for his horse. Copper was dancing nervously, picking up on his panic. "Easy, easy," he murmured, trying to calm her while clutching the infant with one arm. He needed both hands to mount, but he couldn't put the baby down, not on the hard ground, not in her fragile state. He settled for tucking the bundle awkwardly under his left arm while grabbing the saddle horn with his right. It took 3 attempts, and by the time he swung his leg over Copper's back, he could hear the train whistle, a long, mournful sound that echoed across the plains. The engineer had seen something on the tracks, probably saw Caleb himself, and was warning him to clear out. Caleb dug his heels into Copper's flanks, and the mare bolted away from the tracks, carrying them to safety just as the locomotive thundered past. The noise was deafening, the scream of the whistle, the rhythmic hammer of the wheels, the hiss of steam. Freight cars rattled by in an endless procession, and Caleb found himself staring at them, wondering if whoever had left this child was watching from one of those windows. The thought made him sick. When the last car finally passed and the thunder faded into the distance, Caleb looked down at the bundle in his arms. The baby had stopped crying, shocked into silence by the noise. But now her mouth opened again, and a wail emerged that seemed impossibly loud for something so small. All right, Caleb muttered, having no idea what to do. He'd delivered calves and foals, but a human baby was entirely different territory. You're safe now. You're going to be fine. He had no idea if that was true. Caleb turned Copper back toward the wagon road, his mind racing. His homestead was still 2 days' ride to the west, 2 days of rough country with no settlements, no help, nothing but empty land. But behind him, back the way he'd come, was the town of Ridgeway. He'd passed through it yesterday afternoon, a small railroad town with maybe 200 people, a handful of businesses, and more saloons than churches. The decision should have been simple. Take the baby to town, hand her over to the sheriff or a church, and continue on his way. It wasn't his problem. He hadn't asked for this complication. But even as he thought it, Caleb was already turning Copper back toward Ridgeway. The ride took 3 hours. 3 hours of the baby alternating between crying and an ominous silence that scared Caleb more than the noise. He tried everything he could think of, rocking her gently, talking to her in what he hoped was a soothing voice, even attempting to give her water from his canteen, which only made her sputter and cry harder. "Come on, little one," he pleaded as they crested a hill and the buildings of Ridgeway came into view. "Just hold on a bit longer. We'll find someone who knows what to do." The town was busier than it had been the previous day. Wagons lined the main street, and people moved between the shops and businesses with the purposeful energy of a workday morning. Caleb's arrival drew immediate attention. A lone cowboy was common enough, but one carrying a crying infant was decidedly unusual. "That's Caleb Turner," someone murmured as he rode past the general store. He recognized the speaker as the clerk who'd sold him supplies yesterday. "What's he doing with a baby?" Caleb ignored the whispers and headed straight for the small building that served as both the sheriff's office and the town jail. He dismounted carefully, still cradling the bundle, and kicked at the door since his hands were full. No answer. He kicked again, harder. "Sheriff's not here," a voice called from across the street. Caleb turned to see an elderly man in a shopkeeper's apron. "Rode out to the McAllister Ranch yesterday. Some trouble with rustlers. Won't be back for 3, maybe 4 days." Caleb felt his stomach drop. "Who's in charge while he's gone?" The shopkeeper shrugged. "Deputy's over in Silver Creek for a trial. Guess that leaves Mayor Pritchard, but he's drunk more often than not. You need law, mister. You're out of luck." The baby wailed, and several women on the street turned to look. One of them, a stout matron in a severe black dress, approached with her face set in disapproving lines. "Where did you get that child?" she demanded. "Found her," Caleb said shortly. "On the railroad tracks. Someone left her there." Gasps rippled through the growing crowd. The woman in black reached for the baby with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Give her here. This is no matter for a man to handle." Caleb found himself stepping back, the baby pressed protectively against his chest. Something about the woman's cold efficiency reminded him of the matrons at the orphanage where he'd spent his childhood, women who performed charity with all the warmth of an undertaker. "I need to find someone who can help her," he said. "She's been out there for hours. She needs—" "I can see what she needs," the woman interrupted. "A proper Christian home, not the arms of some drifter. Now hand her over before you do more harm." "Mrs. Blackwell." The voice came from behind Caleb, calm but carrying an edge of authority that made the woman's mouth snap shut. "Perhaps we should focus on the child's immediate needs rather than assigning blame." Caleb turned to see a woman approaching from the direction of the schoolhouse at the end of the street. She was perhaps 25, dressed simply but neatly in a gray dress with her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her face was composed, intelligent, and utterly focused on the bundle in his arms. "Miss Hayes," Mrs. Blackwell sniffed. "This is hardly a matter for a school teacher." "On the contrary," the woman, Miss Hayes, replied, coming to stand beside Caleb. "A child in distress is everyone's matter. May I see her?" Her eyes met Caleb's, and he saw something in them that made him trust her, a genuine concern that had nothing to do with propriety or judgment. He carefully shifted the bundle, allowing her to look at the baby's face. Miss Hayes' expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "She's dehydrated and possibly hypothermic. How long was she out there?" "Don't know," Caleb admitted. "Could have been all night. There was a note." He fumbled with the blanket until he found the paper, still pinned to the fabric. He pulled it free and handed it to her. She read the single word, and something flickered across her face. Anger, perhaps, or pain. "Come with me," she said, already turning toward a small house adjacent to the schoolhouse. "We need to get her warm and fed immediately." "Mrs. Blackwell sputtered. "Miss Hayes, you cannot simply—" "I can, and I will," Eleanor Hayes said without breaking stride. "If you wish to help, Mrs. Blackwell, you may fetch some milk from Mr. Patterson's dairy. Otherwise, please step aside." Caleb followed her, acutely aware of the crowd watching their progress down the street. Miss Hayes moved with brisk efficiency, leading him through a tidy front room into a small kitchen where a wood stove already had a fire burning low. "Put her on the table," she instructed, already pulling down jars from a shelf. "Gently, and keep her wrapped. We need to warm her slowly, not all at once." Caleb did as he was told, relieved to have someone competent taking charge. He watched as Miss Hayes worked, her movements quick and practiced. She mixed something in a cup. Water, he thought, with a bit of sugar stirred in. "Hold her upright," she said, and Caleb carefully lifted the baby while Miss Hayes brought the cup to the infant's lips. "Just a few drops at a time. We don't want her to choke." The baby's mouth worked instinctively, and she managed to swallow a little of the liquid, then a little more. After a few minutes, her crying quieted to whimpers, and her color looked marginally better. "Good," Miss Hayes murmured. "That's good. She's stronger than she looks." She glanced up at Caleb. "Tell me exactly what happened. Every detail." Caleb recounted the morning, the sound that had caught his attention, the bundle on the tracks, the approaching train. As he spoke, Miss Hayes continued tending to the baby, her face growing more troubled with each detail. "The 6:47, she said quietly when he finished. "That train runs on schedule. Whoever left her there knew exactly when it would come through." The implication hung in the air between them. The baby hadn't been abandoned with the hope that someone would find her. She'd been placed on the tracks to be killed, but at the last moment, whoever had done it couldn't quite follow through. They'd left her with enough time for the train crew to see her, or for someone like Caleb to happen by. "That's murder," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Or near enough." "Yes." Miss Hayes' hands tightened briefly on the cup before she forced them to relax. "But proving it would be impossible. There are dozens of farms and homesteads within a day's ride. The mother could be anyone, and the father—" She shook her head. The baby had fallen asleep, exhausted by her ordeal. In the quiet kitchen, Caleb became aware of how strange this situation was. Him, a stranger in town, standing in an unmarried woman's home with an abandoned infant. In a place like Ridgeway, that kind of thing would start talk. As if reading his thoughts, Miss Hayes said, "You can't stay here. It wouldn't be appropriate. But you also can't take her with you, not in her condition, and not without knowing how to care for her." "I was planning to head to my claim," Caleb admitted. "Got land 2 days west of here. But I couldn't just leave her. I couldn't—" He stopped, not wanting to explain the complicated tangle of emotions that had driven him back to town instead of forward to his future. Miss Hayes studied him with those intelligent eyes. "What's your name?" "Caleb Turner, ma'am." "Eleanor Hayes. I teach at the school here." She looked down at the sleeping infant. "What are you planning to do with her, Mr. Turner?" It was a fair question, one he'd been avoiding thinking about during the long ride back to Ridgeway. "I figured the sheriff could handle it. Find her a family, maybe. The sheriff won't be back for days. And when he does return, the most likely outcome is that she'll be sent to the Territorial Orphanage in Denver. Do you know anything about that place? Caleb's jaw tightened. Some. Then you know it's overcrowded, underfunded, and children die there regularly from disease and neglect. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes were fierce. This child barely survived one attempt on her life. I won't see her sent to another. What else is there? Caleb asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Someone needs to take responsibility for her. Someone who will protect her and ensure she's cared for properly. Eleanor met his gaze directly. You saved her life, Mr. Turner. The question is whether you're willing to do more than that. Before Caleb could answer, the door opened and Mrs. Blackwell entered without knocking, carrying a jar of milk. She stopped short at the sight of them, standing together in the kitchen, the sleeping baby between them. I've brought the milk, she announced, her tone suggesting this put Caleb and Eleanor in her debt. Though I hardly think it appropriate for Miss Hayes to be entertaining strange men in her home, baby or no baby. Mr. Turner is not entertaining me, Mrs. Blackwell, Eleanor said coolly. He is assisting with the care of an abandoned infant. If you find that inappropriate, you're welcome to leave. Mrs. Blackwell's face flushed. I'm only thinking of your reputation, Eleanor. You know how people talk. Let them. Eleanor took the milk jar and began preparing a feeding. Unless they plan to help this child, their opinions are of no interest to me. Well, Mrs. Blackwell drew herself up. I can see when I'm not wanted, but mark my words, Eleanor Hayes, this association with riffraff will cost you. The school board won't tolerate scandal. She swept out, leaving a heavy silence behind her. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. She's right, you know. This ain't proper. No, Eleanor agreed, testing the temperature of the milk on her wrist with practiced ease. But neither is leaving a child to die on railroad tracks. Propriety has its place, Mr. Turner, but it comes well after basic human decency. She lifted the baby carefully and began feeding her with an improvised bottle made from a whiskey flask and a piece of cloth. The infant fed greedily, and Caleb watched in fascination as Eleanor managed the process with calm competence. You've done this before, he observed. I grew up in a large family. I was the oldest of 7. A small smile touched her lips. My mother used to say I raised half my siblings myself. Why aren't you with them? Your family, I mean. The smile faded. They're in Ohio. I came west to teach 3 years ago. Colorado Territory needs teachers, and I needed... She paused, choosing her words carefully. A fresh start. Caleb understood about fresh starts. That's what he'd been seeking when he filed his homestead claim, a chance to build something new, untainted by the past. But the tiny baby sleeping in Eleanor's arms complicated that vision considerably. I don't know the first thing about raising a child, he said quietly. Neither did I, the first time I held my baby brother. You learn. Eleanor looked up at him. The question isn't whether you know how, it's whether you're willing to try. Why does it have to be me? Because you were the one who stopped. You were the one who pulled her from those tracks when you could have kept riding. That means something, Mr. Turner, whether you want it to or not. Through the window, Caleb could see the sun climbing higher in the sky. Every hour he delayed here was an hour farther from his land, from the life he'd planned. The sensible thing would be to thank Miss Hayes for her help, hand over the baby, and ride out before he got any more tangled up in this situation. He looked at the infant in Eleanor's arms. In sleep, her face was peaceful, unmarked by the cruelty of being labeled unwanted. She was just a baby, innocent, helpless, and entirely dependent on the kindness of strangers. I can't take her to my homestead, Caleb said slowly. I don't have a house built yet. Just raw land. No shelter, no neighbors for miles. She'd never survive it. No, Eleanor agreed. She wouldn't. But I can't leave her to the orphanage either. Not after... He stopped, old memories threatening to surface. Not that. Eleanor watched him struggle with the decision, her expression sympathetic but not pitying. There might be another option, a temporary one. What kind of option? I have a house, small but adequate. I know how to care for an infant. And the school is closed for the summer, so I have the time. She drew a breath. If you were willing to provide financial support, food, supplies, basic necessities, I could care for her here in Ridgeway until the sheriff returns. Then we could make a more permanent decision together. Caleb stared at her. You'd do that? Take on a stranger's baby? She's not a stranger's baby anymore, Mr. Turner. She's a child in need. That's all that matters. Eleanor's voice softened. Besides, I remember what it was like to be young and overwhelmed with responsibility. If I can help, both you and her, then I should. It was a generous offer, too generous, and Caleb knew it. Folks will talk. You already saw Mrs. Blackwell. Mrs. Blackwell would find something to gossip about if I sneezed incorrectly. I stopped letting her dictate my choices some time ago. Eleanor shifted the baby to her shoulder, patting her back gently. But you're right that there will be talk. So we'll need to be clear about the arrangement. You're the one who found her. I'm merely providing temporary assistance until proper arrangements can be made. Nothing more. Nothing more, Caleb echoed, though something about the phrase felt hollow. They worked out the details quickly. Caleb would stay at the boarding house in town and visit daily to check on the baby. He'd pay for all expenses and help Eleanor with any heavy work that needed doing around her property. In 3 or 4 days, when Sheriff Morrison returned, they'd discuss the baby's future together. It was a reasonable plan, a temporary solution to an unexpected problem. So why did Caleb feel like he was committing to something far more permanent? She needs a name, Eleanor said as they prepared to move the baby to a more comfortable sleeping place. We can't just keep calling her the baby. Caleb thought about the note, about that single brutal word. Something better than unwanted. Much better. Eleanor considered for a moment. Mila. It means gracious or dear. She's neither unwanted nor unloved. Not anymore. Mila, Caleb repeated. The name felt right, felt like a declaration against whoever had tried to throw this child away. Mila Turner. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. Turner? If I'm responsible for her, she should have my name, at least until we figure out something more permanent. Caleb met her gaze, defiant. She's not going to any orphanage as a nameless foundling, not if I have anything to say about it. A smile touched Eleanor's lips, the first genuine one he'd seen from her. Mila Turner it is, then. Welcome to the world, little one. We're glad you're here. As the afternoon wore on, Caleb found himself helping Eleanor set up a makeshift cradle from a dresser drawer and making a list of supplies they'd need from the general store. It was strange domestic work, nothing like the hard physical labor he was used to. But there was something satisfying about it, about making a space safe for the tiny life they'd saved. By evening, word had spread through Ridgeway about the abandoned baby and the cowboy who'd rescued her. Caleb endured the stares and whispers as he carried supplies from the general store to Eleanor's house, making multiple trips while trying to ignore the speculation in people's eyes. Some folks were kind. The blacksmith pressed a silver dollar into his hand for the little one, and the woman who ran the boarding house promised to save him the best cuts of meat for that poor motherless child. Others were less generous, their expressions ranging from suspicious to openly hostile. Caleb heard the whispers. What kind of man just happened to find a baby? Maybe he knew more than he was saying. Maybe the baby was his own, and this whole story was a cover. He gritted his teeth and kept walking. He dealt with worse than small-town gossip. It was full dark by the time he finally returned to Eleanor's house with the last load of supplies. Through the window, he could see her moving around the kitchen, the baby in one arm while she worked. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that Caleb paused on the doorstep. This wasn't his life. This domestic tableau, this instant family, none of it was part of his plan. He was supposed to be at his homestead right now, sleeping under the stars, dreaming about the house he'd build and the future he'd create. Alone, independent, answerable to no one. But when Eleanor opened the door and smiled at him, Mila sleeping contentedly against her shoulder, Caleb found he couldn't quite regret the detour. Come in, Eleanor said softly, mindful of the sleeping baby. I've made coffee and there's stew if you're hungry. They sat at her small kitchen table while Mila slept in her drawer cradle nearby. Eleanor had placed it where she could see the baby while they talked, and Caleb noticed how her eyes kept drifting back to check on the infant. A mother's instinct, even though Mila wasn't hers. "She's been good," Eleanor reported. "Fed 3 times, kept it down each time. Her color's much better." "That's good." Caleb wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, grateful for its warmth. "You're good at this. The baby stuff." "Practice," Eleanor said simply. "And necessity. When you're the oldest of 7, you learn quickly." They fell into an easy silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the occasional sigh from the sleeping baby. It should have been awkward, 2 strangers thrown together by circumstance, but somehow it wasn't. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said finally. Caleb nodded, bracing himself for questions about his intentions or his background, questions he wasn't sure he could answer. "That note," Eleanor continued, "when you read it, you looked—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Familiar, like you'd seen it before." Caleb's hands tightened on the cup. "Not the note itself, but the sentiment? Yeah, I've seen that." Eleanor waited, not pushing, just offering space for him to continue if he chose. "I grew up in an orphanage," Caleb heard himself say, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "In St. Louis. Never knew my parents, never knew if I was left there or if they died. The matrons used to say we should be grateful, that we were unwanted children being given Christian charity." Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. "That's why you couldn't leave her. Couldn't let her go through what I did. That place—" Caleb shook his head. "I ran away when I was 14. Figured taking my chances on the streets was better than staying where I wasn't wanted. Worked out okay, I guess. I survived." "More than survived," Eleanor said gently. "You built a life. You're claiming land, starting fresh. That takes courage." "Or stupidity," Caleb managed a rough laugh. "Hard to tell sometimes." "I think it's courage." Eleanor glanced at Mila. "Just like it took courage to stop for her. You could have kept riding. Most people would have. What kind of person rides past a baby on railroad tracks? The kind who's learned to look out for themselves first. The kind who's been hurt enough times that they stop taking risks for others." Eleanor's voice was sad but knowing. "I've met plenty of people like that out here, Mr. Turner. The frontier attracts them. Folks running from their pasts, from their pain. They come west to start over, and they build walls to make sure no one can hurt them again." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, recognizing himself in her description. "And what about you, Miss Hayes? What are you running from?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's a fair question, given what I just said. The truth? An arranged marriage to a man twice my age, chosen by my father to settle a business debt. I was 22, and my whole life was being bartered away like cattle." She looked at Mila. "So I understand about being treated as unwanted, about having your value determined by someone else's convenience. But you got out." "I did. Took all my savings, bought a train ticket west, and never looked back. I tell people I came for adventure, for the opportunity to teach in a growing territory. And that's true, as far as it goes. But really?" She met his eyes. "I came to be free, to make my own choices, to matter because of what I do, not because of who I belong to." The baby stirred, making small sounds in her sleep. Eleanor rose to check on her, adjusting the blanket with tender care. Caleb watched her, struck by the realization that he and this schoolteacher weren't so different, both running toward something new, trying to escape the weight of who they'd been forced to be. "She matters," Caleb said quietly. "Mila, she matters now." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, returning to her seat. "She does, and that's worth everything we're risking to keep her safe." They talked late into the night, their conversation ranging from practical matters, feeding schedules, supply lists, to deeper topics neither had intended to discuss. Caleb found himself telling Eleanor about his years on cattle drives, about breaking horses and surviving winters that killed weaker men. She told him about teaching children who'd never seen a book before, about the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in young eyes. By the time Caleb finally left for the boarding house, something had shifted between them. They weren't strangers anymore, weren't just 2 people thrown together by accident. They were allies, united by a common purpose, protecting a child the world had tried to discard. As Caleb walked through the dark streets of Ridgeway, he thought about the homestead waiting for him in the west. He'd sacrificed so much to claim that land, years of his life, his health, every penny he'd managed to save. It represented everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed about during those long, lonely nights on the trail. But when he pictured his future now, it wasn't just empty plains and a rough cabin. It was Eleanor's kitchen, warm with lamplight. It was Mila's small form sleeping peacefully in her makeshift cradle. It was the feeling of being part of something larger than himself. Maybe that made him a fool. Maybe he was throwing away his chance at the independent life he'd always wanted. But as he climbed the stairs to his room, Caleb couldn't quite bring himself to regret the choice he'd made that morning on the railroad tracks. Some things, he was beginning to understand, were worth more than plans and dreams. Some things, some people, were worth changing everything for. In her small house, Eleanor Hayes sat beside Mila's cradle, watching the baby sleep. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, carrying with it the promise of change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more gossip, more judgment, more questions about this unconventional arrangement. But tonight, watching this tiny life breathe steadily in the lamplight, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Not the purpose of duty or obligation, but the deeper kind, the kind that came from choosing to stand between a vulnerable soul and a world that had already proven its cruelty. She reached out and gently touched Mila's soft cheek. "You're safe now," she whispered. "We won't let you go. Either of us." And somewhere in the darkness, the wind carried that promise out across the plains, into a future that none of them could have predicted, a future that would test them, challenge them, and ultimately transform them all. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, in a small town in Colorado Territory, 3 lives had intersected by chance and choice. An abandoned child, a solitary cowboy, and a determined schoolteacher, brought together by a cruel act and bound by the decision to answer cruelty with compassion. It was, Caleb would later realize, the true beginning of his new life. Not the homestead he'd planned, not the solitary existence he'd imagined, but something far more complicated and infinitely more valuable. A family. Not born, but chosen. Not given, but fought for. And it all began with a single decision on a railroad track at dawn, the decision to stop, to care, to claim what the world had thrown away. The first 3 days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry. Caleb found himself living between 2 worlds, the practical demands of maintaining his presence in town and the growing attachment to the tiny life he'd saved. Each morning he woke before dawn at the boarding house, his body trained by years of ranch work to rise with the sun, and each morning he found himself walking to Eleanor's house before he'd fully decided to do so. On the 4th morning, he arrived to find her already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with Mila cradled in one arm while she attempted to eat breakfast with the other hand. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hair had escaped its usual neat bun in several places. "You look tired," Caleb said, stating the obvious. Eleanor managed a weary smile. Babies don't respect sleep schedules. She was up 4 times last night. She shifted Mila carefully. "But she's eating well, and her color is good. That's what matters." Caleb poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, noting that Eleanor's cup sat cold and untouched beside her plate. "You need rest." "I need about 6 more hours in the day," Eleanor corrected, but without rancor. "It's fine, truly. I've managed with less sleep before." But Caleb could see the exhaustion pulling at her features, the way her movements had lost their usual brisk efficiency. Without thinking about it, he crossed to the table and held out his arms. "Let me take her. You eat properly and drink your coffee while it's hot." Eleanor hesitated, her instinct clearly to refuse, but another long night had worn down her self-sufficiency. She carefully transferred Mila into Caleb's arms, and he was struck by how much more solid the baby felt than she had 4 days ago. She'd put on weight, filled out in that mysterious way infants did when properly fed and cared for. "Support her head," Eleanor instructed, though Caleb was already doing so. "And rock gently. She likes movement." Caleb settled into the rocking chair by the window, cradling Mila against his chest. The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and dark, before drifting closed again. Her breathing was steady, peaceful. In sleep, she looked perfect, innocent of all the cruelty that had marked her entry into the world. "You're a natural," Eleanor observed, finally able to take a proper sip of her coffee. Hardly, but Caleb felt a surge of pride at the words anyway. Just following your instructions. They fell into comfortable silence, Eleanor eating while Caleb rocked the baby. Through the window he could see Ridgeway coming to life, wagons rolling down the main street, shopkeepers opening their doors, the blacksmith's forge already glowing red. It was a scene of ordinary frontier life, people going about their daily business with the sun climbing higher in a cloudless sky. Except nothing about Caleb's life felt ordinary anymore. The sheriff gets back today, Eleanor said quietly, breaking into his thoughts. Or tomorrow at the latest. We need to discuss what we're going to tell him. Caleb had been avoiding this conversation, but he knew she was right. We tell him the truth, that I found Mila on the tracks and brought her here, that you've been caring for her. And then what? What do we say when he asks about her future? The question hung in the air between them. Caleb looked down at Mila, at her tiny fingers curled against his shirt, at the absolute trust in her sleeping face. In 4 days, she'd become real to him, not just a responsibility, but a person, someone who mattered. I'm not letting her go to that orphanage, he said, his voice low but certain. Whatever else happens, that's not an option. Eleanor set down her fork. I agree, but that leaves us with limited choices. We could try to find a local family willing to adopt her, though that would take time. Or, she paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. Or someone could claim her, take legal responsibility. You mean me? I mean whoever's willing and able. I would do it myself, but an unmarried woman adopting a child? Eleanor shook her head. The scandal would cost me my position. The school board barely tolerates an unmarried teacher as it is. They certainly won't accept one with an unexplained infant. Caleb understood the calculation she was making, the brutal practicality of their situation. In a town like Ridgeway, in a territory still defining its social codes, reputation mattered. Eleanor had already risked hers by taking in Mila these past days. Asking her to sacrifice her livelihood was too much. What about my homestead? He asked, thinking out loud. I could claim her, build a place for us both. 2 days from the nearest town, with no neighbors and no help? Eleanor's tone was gentle but firm. Caleb, you're a capable man, but you can't farm land and raise an infant at the same time. Not alone. She needs constant care, feeding every few hours, watching to make sure she's healthy. If something went wrong out there, you'd have no one to turn to. So what are you saying, that I give her up after all? No. Eleanor met his eyes. I'm saying we need a better solution, one that protects both Mila and your ability to provide for her. Before Caleb could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Eleanor rose to answer it, and Caleb heard a familiar gruff voice from the entryway. Miss Hayes, it's Sheriff Morrison. I heard you've been looking after a foundling. The sheriff was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He removed his hat as he entered the kitchen, nodding to Caleb before his gaze fixed on the baby. This her? He asked unnecessarily. This is Mila, Eleanor confirmed, returning to her seat. Mr. Turner found her on the railroad tracks 4 mornings ago. Someone had abandoned her there. Morrison's jaw tightened. Left her to be run over by the morning freight? Or hoping the train crew would spot her in time, Caleb added. There was a note. Said Unwanted. The sheriff swore quietly, then caught himself and apologized to Eleanor. Begging your pardon, ma'am. But that's about the lowest thing I've heard. You got any idea who might have done it? Caleb shook his head. Could be anyone. A farm wife who couldn't feed another mouth, some girl in trouble with no one to turn to. We'll probably never know. Morrison pulled out a chair and sat heavily. Tell me everything, from the beginning. For the next half hour, Caleb recounted the events of that morning, the sound that caught his attention, finding Mila on the tracks, the race to get her away before the train arrived. Eleanor described this baby's condition when Caleb brought her to town and the care she'd provided since then. The sheriff listened without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When they finished, he sat quietly for a moment, absently turning his hat in his hands. Well, he said finally, first things first, we need to make this official. I'll file a report about the abandonment, though I doubt we'll ever find who did it. As for the child herself, He looked at Mila, still sleeping peacefully in Caleb's arms. Normally, she'd be sent to the territorial orphanage in Denver. That's standard procedure for foundlings. No, Caleb said flatly. Morrison's eyebrows rose. Son, I understand you saved her life, but that doesn't give you legal standing to— I'll claim her. The words were out before Caleb fully thought them through, but once spoken, he knew they were right. I'll adopt her. Make it legal and proper. Whatever needs to be done. The sheriff exchanged a glance with Eleanor. You know what you're taking on? A baby's a lifetime commitment. You can't just change your mind when it gets hard. I know. Caleb's arms tightened protectively around Mila. I grew up in an orphanage, Sheriff. I know exactly what her life would be like in that place. I won't condemn her to it. He means it, Eleanor added quietly. And he's been here every day, helping with her care. This isn't a rash decision. Morrison studied them both, his lawman's eyes taking in details Caleb suspected they'd rather keep private. The easy familiarity between them, the domestic scene in Eleanor's kitchen, the way she'd spoken up in Caleb's defense without being asked. All right, the sheriff said slowly. I can draw up adoption papers, make it official. But Turner, you need to understand what folks will say. An unmarried man claiming a foundling baby? Some people are going to assume she's yours, that this whole story is a cover for getting caught with some woman. Let them assume what they want. I know the truth. That's all well and good, but it affects more than just you. Morrison gestured to Eleanor. Miss Hayes has already put her reputation on the line caring for the child. If you claim her but keep the baby here with a school teacher— He shook his head. The gossip will ruin her. She'll lose her position. Eleanor's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. That's my concern, Sheriff, not yours. Actually, ma'am, it's everyone's concern. This town needs a teacher, and you're a good one. I'd hate to see you driven out over this. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Caleb felt the trap of their situation closing in. He couldn't take Mila to his homestead alone. Eleanor couldn't keep her without destroying her reputation, and sending the baby to Denver was unacceptable to them both. There's another option, Morrison said carefully. Not one I'd normally suggest, but given the circumstances— He looked between them. You two could marry, make it a proper family arrangement that would settle the gossip and give the child a stable home. Caleb felt the words like a physical blow. Marriage. To a woman he'd known for 4 days. It was absurd, impossible, completely impractical. And yet, looking at Eleanor's shocked expression, he found himself considering it. That's not— Eleanor started, then stopped. We barely know each other. True enough, Morrison agreed. But you've spent 4 days caring for a baby together, which is more than some couples do before their wedding. And from what I've seen, you work well as a team. He stood, replacing his hat. I'm not saying you have to decide right now, but think about it. I'll come back tomorrow for your answer about the adoption. If you choose to go forward, we'll need to sort out the legal details. After the sheriff left, the kitchen felt smaller, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Mila stirred in Caleb's arms, making small sounds that meant she'd be hungry soon. Eleanor moved automatically to prepare a bottle, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. Marriage, she said finally, not looking at him. He suggested marriage. He did. Caleb shifted Mila carefully. You think he's right? About the gossip? Oh, the gossip's already started. Mrs. Blackwell has made sure of that. Eleanor tested the milk temperature on her wrist. But Morrison's right that adopting Mila while keeping her here with me would make things impossible. The school board wouldn't tolerate it. So we're back to the same problem. I can't take her alone. You can't keep her alone, and neither of us will send her to Denver. Eleanor brought the bottle to him, and together they managed the transfer, Caleb holding Mila, while Eleanor guided the bottle to her mouth. The baby latched on eagerly, her eyes opening to stare up at them with that unfocused infant gaze that somehow felt deeply knowing. What if we did it? Eleanor asked softly. Not a real marriage, not in the sense of— She flushed slightly. But a practical arrangement. For Mila's sake. Caleb's heart was beating faster than he'd like to admit. A marriage of convenience. Exactly. We could claim Mila together, give her a proper home. You could still work your land. It's summer now, so you'd have months to build a cabin, prepare for winter. I could care for Mila during the week, and you could visit on weekends. Then, when the homestead is ready, we could all move out there together. And the marriage part? Eleanor finally met his eyes. We'd be partners, colleagues raising a child together. Nothing more unless we both wanted it to be. It was a reasonable proposal, practical even. They got along well, shared common values, and both cared deeply about Mila's welfare. Plenty of frontier marriages were based on less. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far more complicated than a simple arrangement. "What about what you want?" he asked. "You came west to be free, to make your own choices. Marrying me would tie you down to a homestead, to a life of hard work and isolation. That's not freedom." "Neither is losing my position and being driven out of town," Eleanor countered. "At least this way, I choose who I'm tied to. And Mila," her voice softened as she watched the baby eat. "Mila deserves better than being shuttled between arrangements, always wondering if she's wanted. If we do this properly, she'll have a real home. Two parents who chose to keep her safe. Even if those parents are strangers." "We're not strangers anymore," Eleanor smiled faintly. 4 days of caring for a baby together. We've seen each other exhausted, frustrated, worried. That's more honesty than most courting couples share. She had a point. Caleb had seen Eleanor at her most vulnerable, had shared the intimate work of caring for an infant. He knew she was patient, practical, and fiercely protective. He knew she took her coffee black, that she hummed while she worked, that she checked on Mila at least 3 times every hour, even when the baby was sleeping peacefully. And if he was honest with himself, he admired her. Not just her competence, but her courage, the way she'd stood up to Mrs. Blackwell, the way she'd risked her reputation without hesitation to help a child in need. "We should at least think about it," he said carefully. "Not decide right now, but consider whether it could work." Eleanor nodded. "Agreed. Let's give ourselves until tomorrow when the sheriff returns. That gives us time to think clearly." But thinking clearly proved difficult with Mila between them, a constant reminder of what was at stake. They spent the day in careful domestic routine, Caleb helping with chores while Eleanor tended to the baby, both of them dancing around the enormous question hanging over them. By evening, Caleb had worn a path in Eleanor's floor from pacing. She sat in the rocking chair with Mila, watching him with patient amusement. "You're going to walk a groove in the boards," she observed. "Sorry." Caleb forced himself to sit at the table. "I just keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong." "Name them." He blinked. "What?" "Name all the ways it could go wrong. Let's examine each one." Eleanor's teacher instincts were showing. "If we're going to make this decision, we should do it with our eyes open." Caleb took a breath. "All right. We could marry and then realize we can't stand each other, end up trapped in a miserable arrangement." "Possible," Eleanor agreed, "though we've already spent considerable time together under stressful circumstances and haven't come to blows yet. That's encouraging. The homestead could fail. Land's not guaranteed, drought, locusts, any number of things could ruin a crop. We could end up destitute. You have savings, I have my teaching salary. Between us, we could weather a bad season or two. And I know how to make do with very little. Remember, I'm the oldest of 7. I can stretch a dollar further than most. What if..." Caleb hesitated, then pushed forward. "What if one of us meets someone else? Someone we actually want to marry?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, rocking Mila gently. "Then we'd have to discuss it honestly." "But Caleb, we're not children. I'm 25, you're 32. If we haven't found passionate love by now, perhaps we're not meant for that kind of marriage. Perhaps partnership and shared purpose are enough." "Is that enough for you?" She looked at him directly. "I watched my mother in a marriage based on passionate love. My father adored her, and she him. But love didn't pay the bills when his business failed. It didn't feed 7 children when times were hard. My mother worked herself to exhaustion for love, and when I left for the West, she looked 10 years older than she was." Eleanor's voice was firm. "I'd rather have a partner who respects me and shares my goals than a husband who claims to love me but expects me to sacrifice everything for his dreams." Caleb understood what she wasn't saying, that her arranged marriage would have been exactly that kind of sacrifice. And you think I'd respect you as a partner? I think you already do. You've listened to my opinions about Mila's care, you've helped without being asked, you've treated me as an equal rather than a servant. That's more than many wives get from husbands they've known for years. The baby had fallen asleep, and Eleanor rose to place her in the cradle. Caleb watched her tuck the blanket around Mila with such tenderness that something in his chest tightened. What if I'm not good enough? The words came out rougher than he'd intended. I don't know anything about being a father. I could fail her, fail both of you. Eleanor returned to her chair, folding her hands in her lap. Caleb, you stopped for a crying baby when you could have kept riding. You brought her to safety instead of abandoning her. You've been here every day, learning how to care for her, even when it's awkward and uncomfortable. You're already choosing to be good enough. That's what matters. But what if it's not? What if I turn out like... He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Like whoever left her on those tracks? Eleanor's voice was gentle. You won't. That person gave up when things got hard. You're here precisely because things are hard, and you're refusing to give up. That makes all the difference. They talked late into the night, examining the proposal from every angle. Eleanor was practical, laying out how they could manage finances, living arrangements, the challenges of homesteading with a baby. Caleb was more emotional, though he tried to hide it, wrestling with fears he couldn't quite name. But underneath all the practical considerations, both of them kept circling back to the same truth. They couldn't let Mila go. And if marriage was the only way to keep her safe, then perhaps it was worth the risk. There's one more thing we should discuss, Eleanor said as the clock struck midnight. If we do this, if we marry, I need to know you won't try to control my life. I've escaped one cage. I won't walk willingly into another. Yet, I'm not looking for someone to control, Caleb assured her. I've been on my own too long to want that. If anything, I'd be relieved to have a partner who can think for herself. And I need to be able to continue teaching, at least until the homestead is established. My salary could make the difference between success and failure that first year. Makes sense to me. Eleanor studied him in the lamplight. You're serious about this, about all of it. Are you? She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving to the cradle where Mila slept. I came west to make my own choices, to build a life that mattered. I thought that meant staying unmarried, staying independent. She looked back at Caleb. But maybe the most important choice isn't between marriage and independence. Maybe it's choosing who you build a life with and why. And you'd choose this? Choose us? I'd choose Mila, Eleanor corrected gently. Everything else follows from that. If marrying you means she grows up safe and wanted and loved, then yes, I choose this. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even particularly romantic, but it was honest, and Caleb found he valued that more than pretty words. Then I guess we're getting married, he said. Eleanor smiled, not the polite smile she gave to acquaintances, but a real smile, tentative and hopeful. I guess we are. When Sheriff Morrison returned the next morning, they told him together. The lawman didn't look surprised. Figured you might come to that conclusion, he said, pulling out papers from his saddlebag. I took the liberty of bringing both adoption papers and a marriage license, just in case. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Awfully presumptuous of you, Sheriff. Practical, Morrison corrected with a slight smile. I've been doing this job long enough to recognize two stubborn people who won't give up on a child. Didn't take a genius to figure out where that would lead. They signed the papers at Eleanor's kitchen table with Mila sleeping nearby, making them a legal family in the eyes of the territorial government. Caleb's hand shook slightly as he wrote his name, the weight of what he was committing to finally sinking in. Congratulations, Morrison said, witnessing the final signature. You're now husband and wife, and legal parents to Miss Mila Turner. May you all find happiness together. After he left, Caleb and Eleanor stood awkwardly in the kitchen, suddenly aware that everything had changed. They were married, they were parents, they were a family, however unconventional. Well, Eleanor said finally, I suppose we should discuss the practical arrangements. You'll need to work on the homestead, and I'll stay here with Mila until... Wait, Caleb held up a hand. Before we jump into logistics, there's something I need to say. Eleanor waited, her expression cautious. This marriage, it's practical. It's for Mila, and that's fine. But I want you to know that I take it seriously anyway. You're my wife now, even if that happened faster than either of us planned. And that means I'll do right by you. I'll work hard. I'll provide what I can, and I'll never ask you to be something you're not. He met her eyes. You have my word on that. Eleanor's expression softened. And you have mine. We're partners in this, Caleb. Equal partners. Whatever comes, we face it together. She held out her hand and Caleb took it, sealing their unlikely partnership with a handshake that felt more binding than any wedding vow. From her cradle, Mila made a soft sound, not quite a cry, but a declaration of presence. Both of them turned to look at her, this tiny person who had turned their lives upside down in less than a week. What have we done? Caleb wondered aloud. Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure release. Something completely impractical and probably foolish, but also the only right thing we could do. She was right, Caleb realized. They jumped into the unknown, committed to a marriage based on circumstance rather than romance, taken on responsibility for a child neither had planned for. By any reasonable measure, they should probably be terrified. Instead, watching Eleanor lift Mila from the cradle and seeing the way the baby instinctively settled into her arms, Caleb felt something uncomfortably close to hope. Maybe this wasn't the life he'd planned when he filed for that homestead. Maybe it was messy and complicated and filled with uncertainty. But as Eleanor handed him Mila and their fingers brushed in the transfer, as he looked down at the baby who'd somehow become his daughter in less than a week, Caleb thought maybe messy and complicated was exactly what he'd needed all along. Ready to be a family? Eleanor asked quietly. Caleb adjusted his hold on Mila, feeling her solid warmth against his chest. Ready as I'll ever be. And with that simple declaration, they stepped together into their new life. Three people bound not by blood or romance, but by choice and courage and a shared refusal to let the world's cruelty have the final word. The reality of their new arrangement settled over them like snow, gradual at first, then impossible to ignore. Caleb spent his days working on the homestead while Eleanor managed the house and cared for Mila. And at night he returned to sleep in the small spare room Eleanor had cleared for him. They were married in name and law, but the emotional distance between them remained carefully maintained, neither quite ready to bridge the gap between partnership and something more intimate. 2 weeks after the wedding, Caleb sat at Eleanor's kitchen table going over their finances. The numbers weren't encouraging. The lumber alone will cost more than I estimated, he said, rubbing his temples. And that's assuming I can get it hauled out to the claim without paying extra for transport. Eleanor poured him more coffee, Mila asleep against her shoulder. What if you built smaller? Started with just 2 rooms instead of 3? 2 rooms for 3 people and all our supplies? Caleb shook his head. We'd be climbing over each other come winter. Better than not having a roof at all. Eleanor sat across from him, adjusting Mila's position with the unconscious ease she'd developed. We could expand later, once the first harvest brings in money. If there is a harvest, that land's never been worked before. Could be the soil's no good, or there's not enough water, or... He stopped himself, hearing the defeat creeping into his voice. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her free hand over his. The gesture was simple, companionable, but it steadied him anyway. One problem at a time, Caleb. First we build shelter, then we plant, then we see what grows. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. It was the most deliberate physical contact they'd had since signing the marriage papers, and he felt her slight intake of breath before she squeezed his hand and released it. You're right, he said. I'll adjust the plans. 2 rooms to start, expandable later. And I'll talk to the school board about teaching through the fall. My salary should cover our basic supplies until... A sharp knock interrupted her. They exchanged glances before Eleanor rose to answer it, Caleb close behind. Mrs. Blackwell stood on the doorstep, her expression carved from disapproval. Behind her stood 2 other members of the school board, Mr. Patterson, who ran the dairy, and Mrs. Chen, who owned the dry goods store. Mrs. Turner, Mrs. Blackwell said, investing Eleanor's new name with unmistakable disdain. We need to speak with you about your position. Eleanor's spine straightened. Of course, please come in. The 3 filed into the front room, pointedly refusing to sit when Eleanor gestured to the chairs. Mr. Patterson at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mrs. Chen's face was carefully neutral. "We'll be brief," Mrs. Blackwell began. "The school board has reviewed your situation, and we've come to a decision about your continued employment." Caleb moved to stand beside Eleanor, a silent show of solidarity. Mila stirred at the tension in the air, whimpering softly. "What decision?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the baby in her arms. "The board feels that given the irregularity of your marriage and the questionable circumstances surrounding the child, it would be inappropriate for you to continue teaching our children." Mrs. Blackwell delivered the words with evident satisfaction. "Your contract will not be renewed for the coming school year." The words hit like a physical blow. Caleb felt Eleanor stiffen beside him, saw the color drain from her face. They'd known this was a possibility, but hearing it stated so baldly was different from abstract worry. "Questionable circumstances?" Eleanor's voice had gone quiet and dangerous. "You mean rescuing an abandoned infant from certain death?" "I mean," Mrs. Blackwell said primly, "a hasty marriage to a drifter, followed by the sudden appearance of a convenient baby. Some of us have questions about the timing." "Then ask them." Caleb stepped forward, his temper finally breaking. "You think Mila's mine? That I got some woman in trouble and concocted this whole story to cover it up?" "The thought has occurred to several people," Mrs. Blackwell admitted. "Then those people are fools." Eleanor's voice cut across the room. "Sheriff Morrison filed a complete report about the abandonment. The evidence is documented. If you choose to invent scandal instead of accepting the truth, that says more about your character than ours." Mrs. Chen shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor, no one's accusing you of lying, but you must admit the situation is unusual. And with a baby in the house, how could you possibly give your students the attention they deserve?" "I managed to raise 6 siblings while helping my mother run a household," Eleanor said sharply. "I think I can handle teaching and motherhood simultaneously." "That may be," Mr. Patterson interjected, speaking for the first time. "But Mrs. Blackwell has a point about appearances. Parents are already talking. Some are saying they won't send their children to be taught by a woman of questionable judgment." "Questionable judgment?" Eleanor's voice rose slightly, making Mila fuss. She lowered it with visible effort. "I showed compassion to a dying child. If that's questionable judgment, then I'm guilty and proud of it." "Nevertheless," Mrs. Blackwell said, "the board's decision is final. You have until the end of the month to vacate the teacherage." "This house belongs to the school," Mrs. Chen added more gently. "I'm sorry, Eleanor, but without the teaching position, you can't remain here." The full scope of their problem suddenly became clear. Without Eleanor's salary and without the house, they had nothing, just Caleb's meager savings and an unfinished homestead 2 days' ride away. Winter was 4 months off, maybe less if the season came early. They'd never be ready in time. "Wait!" Mr. Patterson raised a hand. "Before we go, I want it on record that I voted against this decision. What's happening here isn't right, and we all know it." Mrs. Blackwell's eyes flashed. "Your objection is noted, Mr. Patterson. It changes nothing." After they left, Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at nothing. Mila had begun crying in earnest now, picking up on her mother's distress. Caleb gently took the baby from Eleanor's arms. "I'll tend to her," he said quietly. "You sit down." But Eleanor didn't sit. She paced to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. 4 weeks. We have 4 weeks to build a house, establish a homestead, and prepare for winter. It's impossible." "Then we'll do the impossible." Caleb rocked Mila, trying to soothe her cries. "I'll work faster, longer hours. We'll make it work somehow." "How?" Eleanor spun to face him, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw fear in her eyes. "Caleb, be realistic. Even if you work day and night, you can't build a proper house in 4 weeks. And winter on the high plains with an infant in a half-finished cabin? We'd freeze. Mila would—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The baby's cries intensified, and Caleb felt his own panic rising to match Eleanor's. She was right. They were trapped by circumstances with no good options. And it was all because he'd stopped on that railroad track. If he'd just kept riding, Eleanor would still have her position, her security. She'd sacrificed everything to help him save Mila, and now they were all paying the price. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but necessary. This is my fault. I brought this down on you. Eleanor's laugh was sharp and humorless. Your fault? Caleb, I made my own choices. I knew the risks. She crossed to him, taking Mila back and settling into the rocking chair with practiced efficiency. But knowing the risks doesn't make facing them any easier. They sat in silence while Eleanor nursed Mila, the baby's cries gradually subsiding into the rhythmic sounds of feeding. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, peaceful and golden, utterly at odds with the turmoil inside the house. We could go to my family, Eleanor said finally. In Ohio. They wouldn't turn us away and Mila would be safe. Caleb's chest tightened. And my homestead? The claim? You'd have to abandon it. The government requires improvement within a year. If you're not there working the land, you'll lose it. She looked at him over Mila's head. But at least we'd survive. At least Mila would have a roof over her head and food to eat. Everything Caleb had worked for, every dollar saved and hardship endured, condensed into 160 acres of Colorado dirt. Walking away from it felt like cutting off a limb, but what good was land if his family froze to death before spring? Is that what you want? He asked. To go back to Ohio? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hand gently stroking Mila's downy head. I want Mila to be safe. Everything else is secondary to that. But is it what you want? Caleb pressed. You came west to escape an arranged marriage, to make your own life. Going back would mean admitting defeat. Sometimes defeat is wiser than stubborn pride. And sometimes, Caleb said slowly, an idea forming, there's a third option we haven't considered. Eleanor looked up, cautious hope flickering in her eyes. What option? What if we didn't try to finish the homestead in 4 weeks? What if we found somewhere closer to stay through the winter, somewhere I could work while keeping you and Mila safe? Then comes spring, when the weather breaks, we move out to the claim, and I have a full season to build properly. Where would we stay? We can't afford to rent in town, and even if we could, the same gossip that cost me my position would follow us. Caleb's mind was racing now, pieces falling into place. The old Garrett place, about 5 miles east of town, right on the creek. I heard in the saloon that it's been empty since the widow Garrett died last fall. That house is half collapsed, Eleanor objected. The roof leaks and the windows are broken. But the walls are solid, and it's got a working fireplace. Give me a week and I could make it weatherproof enough to get through winter. It's not pretty, but it's better than nothing. Eleanor considered this, her expression thoughtful. And you think whoever owns it now would let us stay? Widow Garrett's daughter lives in Denver. From what I heard, she's been trying to sell the property but hasn't found a buyer. We could offer to maintain it in exchange for living there through winter. She'd probably be grateful to have someone keeping squatters out. It's still 5 miles from town. If something went wrong with Mila, if she got sick, 5 miles is a hard ride but not impossible. And it's a damn sight closer than 2 days to the homestead. Caleb leaned forward. Eleanor, I know it's not ideal, but it gives us time. Time to prepare properly, time to save more money, time to make sure we're ready before we move out to the claim. She looked down at Mila, now sleeping peacefully in her arms. And if the daughter says no, if she won't let us stay, then we'll figure something else out, but we have to try. The next morning, Caleb rode out to find the Garrett place. Eleanor's description had been accurate. The small ranch house was in rough shape, with half the shutters hanging loose and visible gaps in the roof. But the stone walls were solid, and the location was good, sheltered in a fold of land with the creek running clear and cold just 50 yards away. He spent the day assessing what would need to be done, making lists and calculations. It was hard work, but not impossible. With dedication and long hours, he could make it livable. That evening, he sent a telegram to Mrs. Garrett's daughter in Denver, explaining their situation and making his proposal. The response came 2 days later, brief but positive. They could stay through winter in exchange for maintaining the property and making necessary repairs. The daughter would even provide lumber for the roof if Caleb would fix the sagging porch. It wasn't perfect, but it was a chance. The news spread through Ridgeway quickly. The scandalous schoolteacher and her questionable husband were leaving town, moving to the old Garrett place. The gossip followed them like smoke, but Caleb found he cared less with each passing day. Let them talk. His family would survive, and that was all that mattered. The word family still felt strange in his mind, but increasingly right. Somewhere in the chaos of the past weeks, these two females had become his responsibility in a way that went beyond legal papers. When Mila cried at night, he woke automatically, listening to make sure Eleanor had her. When Eleanor looked tired, he found himself making coffee without being asked, taking the baby so she could rest. They were becoming a unit, learning each other's rhythms and needs with the unconscious choreography of people sharing close quarters and common purpose. Moving day arrived with a gray sky that threatened rain. Caleb loaded their belongings into a borrowed wagon while Eleanor packed the last items, Mila strapped to her chest in a sling she'd fashioned from spare cloth. Several townspeople watched from windows and doorways, but no one offered to help. Only Mr. Patterson appeared, pressing a cloth-wrapped package into Eleanor's hands. "Cheese and butter," he said gruffly, "and I'll bring milk out to the Garrett place once a week. No charge." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. You've been kinder than we had any right to expect." "Some of us still remember what community mean," Patterson tipped his hat to Caleb. "You take care of them, Turner, and if you need help with repairs, send word. I'm handy with a hammer." The ride to the Garrett place took 2 hours, Caleb driving the wagon while Eleanor sat beside him with Mila. Neither spoke much, both lost in their own thoughts about this new phase of their unlikely life together. When the house came into view, Eleanor drew a sharp breath. Caleb had been there every day for the past week, working frantically to make it habitable, but he'd kept the results secret, wanting to surprise her. The roof was patched, the windows covered with oiled paper that would let in light while keeping out wind. The porch no longer sagged, and he'd even managed to clear away the weeds and debris that had accumulated around the foundation. It wasn't beautiful, but it looked cared for, like a home instead of a ruin. "Caleb?" Eleanor breathed. "You did all this?" "Had some help from Patterson and his son the last 2 days," Caleb admitted, pleased by her reaction. "But yeah, most of it. I wanted it to be ready for you, for both of you." Inside, Eleanor's surprise continued. Caleb had scrubbed the floors, whitewashed the walls, and set up furniture borrowed from various sources. The main room had a table, chairs, and a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace. Through an open door, she could see a bedroom with a proper bed and a cradle he'd built himself, rough but sturdy. "There's another bedroom through there," Caleb said, pointing to a second door. "Smaller, but it's got a window and room for a bed. I figured you and Mila could take the bigger room, and I'd use the small one." Eleanor turned to face him, Mila stirring between them. "You built a cradle. Baby needed somewhere safe to sleep." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly self-conscious. "It's not fancy, but it's solid. Won't collapse or nothing." "It's perfect." Eleanor's voice was thick with emotion. "All of this is perfect. I can't believe you did so much in just a week." "Well, we're family now. Taking care of family is what matters." The word hung between them, family. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Yes, we are." That night, after they'd unpacked and settled in, after Mila had been fed and put down in her new cradle, Caleb and Eleanor sat by the fireplace drinking coffee. The house creaked and settled around them, not quite home yet, but getting closer. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about what happens next, after winter." "The homestead," Caleb said, knowing where she was heading. "We'll need to move out there come spring. And I'll need to decide what to do about teaching. I can't get my position back in Ridgeway, but there might be other towns, other schools that need teachers." Caleb set down his cup. "You want to keep teaching?" "I love teaching. It's not just a job to me. It's who I am. Helping children learn, watching them discover new ideas." She smiled slightly. "I'd miss it terribly if I gave it up entirely. But out at the homestead, there won't be schools nearby. It'll be hard to do both." "I know. That's why I'm trying to think through what's possible." Eleanor looked at him directly. "What do you want, Caleb?" "Not just for the land, but for us, for this family we're building." It was a fair question, and one Caleb had been avoiding asking himself. What did he want? The original plan had been simple: claim land, build a ranch, live independently. But that plan hadn't included a wife or a daughter, hadn't accounted for the ways his wants might change when he was no longer alone. "I want Mila to grow up safe," he said carefully. "I want her to have opportunities, to know she's wanted and valued, and I want—" He paused, surprised by his own realization. "I want to build something that lasts. Not just a house or a ranch, but a real home, the kind I never had growing up." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And where do I fit in that vision? Honestly, I'm still figuring that out." Caleb met her eyes. "I know you're my wife, my partner. I know I respect you and trust you with Mila. But everything happened so fast, I haven't had time to think about what we could be beyond the arrangement we made." "That's fair." Eleanor's expression was thoughtful rather than hurt. "I'm still figuring it out too. We married for practical reasons, but we're living as a family now. The lines are blurring. Is that a problem?" "I don't know yet. Ask me again in a few months." She smiled, taking the edge off the uncertainty. "For now, let's just focus on getting through each day. Winter will be here before we know it." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and oddly satisfying. Caleb worked from dawn to dusk making repairs and improvements to the property, while Eleanor managed the household and cared for Mila. In the evenings, they sat together going over accounts, planning for spring, talking about everything and nothing. Slowly, carefully, they were building something neither had expected. Not just a functional partnership, but genuine friendship. Caleb found himself looking forward to evenings by the fire, to Eleanor's dry observations about life and her stories about teaching. Eleanor seemed to relax around him, her careful formality giving way to easier conversation and occasional laughter. And Mila thrived. At 6 weeks old, she was filling out beautifully, her eyes beginning to focus and track movement. She smiled, or at least made expressions that might be smiles, when Caleb held her, and she settled most easily when Eleanor sang softly while rocking her to sleep. One evening in late August, with summer fading into the first hints of autumn, Eleanor appeared in the doorway while Caleb was chopping wood. Mila was awake in her arms, looking around with those increasingly alert eyes. "She's getting so big," Eleanor said, running a gentle finger down the baby's cheek. "Hard to believe she's the same tiny thing you found on those tracks." Caleb set down the axe and wiped his brow. "Hard to believe that was only 6 weeks ago. Feels like a lifetime." "For her, it is a lifetime." Eleanor shifted Mila to her shoulder. "Caleb, I've been meaning to ask you something about that day." "What about it?" "You said you heard her crying from the wagon road, that the sound caught your attention, but the tracks were 50 yards away, and she was so small. How did you hear her over the wind and the wagon noise?" Caleb had wondered about that himself in quiet moments. "I don't know. Maybe the wind was right carrying the sound. Maybe my hearing's better than I thought." "Or maybe," Eleanor said softly, "you were meant to find her. Maybe all of this, the timing, the circumstances, us ending up together, maybe it wasn't just random chance." "You believe in fate?" "I believe that sometimes when you pay attention, life offers you exactly what you need, even if it's not what you thought you wanted." She looked down at Mila, then back at Caleb. "I didn't want a husband or a hard life on a homestead. I wanted independence and freedom, but this," she gestured at the house, at him, at the baby between them. "This feels right in a way nothing else ever has." Caleb felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening that he hadn't known was closed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It does." That night, after Mila was asleep and Eleanor had retired to her room, Caleb sat alone by the dying fire and thought about the path that had brought him here. Every choice, every hardship, every year of solitary work had been leading to that moment on the railroad tracks. If he'd left St. Louis a day later, if he'd taken a different route west, if he'd been 5 minutes slower that morning, everything would be different. But he hadn't been. He'd been exactly where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there. And now he had a family, fragile and new and utterly unexpected. The question was what he would do with this gift. Would he let fear and old patterns keep him at a distance, maintaining the careful boundaries of their arrangement? Or would he take the risk of letting these two people all the way in, of building something real from the practical foundation they'd laid? Outside, the wind picked up. carrying the scent of approaching autumn and the promise of challenges to come. Winter would test them, would reveal whether this hastily assembled family could withstand pressure and hardship. But for the first time in his life, Caleb found himself hoping not just to survive, but to build something worth keeping, and that hope, terrifying as it was, felt like the beginning of something precious. September arrived with crisp mornings and the first yellow leaves scattered across the property like gold coins. Caleb had begun making weekly trips to his homestead, spending 3 or 4 days at a time breaking ground and preparing the land for spring planting. Each departure felt harder than the last, and each return brought an unexpected surge of relief when he saw the lamplight in the garret house windows. He'd been gone 4 days this time, working until his hands bled to clear rocks from a promising field. When he finally rode up to the house at dusk, he found Eleanor sitting on the porch steps with Mila, both of them watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You're back early," Eleanor said, but there was pleasure in her voice rather than surprise. "Finished what I needed to do." Caleb dismounted, suddenly aware of how dirty and exhausted he must look. "How's she been?" "Perfect, as always." Eleanor stood, holding Mila out to him. "Though I think she missed you. She's been fussy the past 2 evenings." Caleb took the baby, and Mila immediately settled against his chest with a contented sigh. Something warm expanded in his ribcage, the now familiar sensation of being needed, being wanted, being home. "I missed her too," he admitted. "Missed both of you, if I'm being honest." Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly in the fading light. "Well, you're just in time for supper. I made stew and there's fresh bread from this morning." Inside, the house smelled of cooking and wood smoke and the subtle lavender soap Eleanor used. Caleb realized with a start that these scents meant home to him now, more than any place he'd ever lived. The orphanage had smelled of lye and boiled cabbage. His various bunkhouses had smelled of unwashed men and tobacco. But this smelled like family. Over supper, Eleanor told him about the week's events. Mr. Patterson had brought milk as promised, and his wife had included a basket of vegetables from their garden. A traveling preacher had stopped by, offering to pray over Mila, but Eleanor had politely declined. The roof had leaked during Tuesday's rain, but only in the corner of the main room, and she'd caught the water in a bucket. "I'll fix that tomorrow," Caleb said, making a mental note. "Can't have you dealing with leaks while I'm gone." "It's nothing I couldn't handle," but Eleanor smiled, accepting his concern. "Though I'll admit it's easier when you're here, the nights especially." "Nights?" She hesitated, then continued. "There are coyotes that come close after dark. They don't bother the house, but their howling frightens me sometimes. Not for myself, but for Mila. I keep thinking about predators, about how vulnerable we are out here." Caleb understood the fear beneath her words. They were isolated, miles from help, with a baby to protect. "I could stay closer, make shorter trips to the homestead." "No, you need to prepare that land. We can't delay spring planting just because I'm nervous about wildlife." Eleanor stood to clear the dishes. "I'm being foolish. We're perfectly safe." But that night, Caleb heard the coyotes too, a chorus of yips and howls that seemed to circle the property. He rose from his bed and quietly checked the main room, making sure the doors and windows were secure. Through Eleanor's partially open bedroom door, he could see her standing by Mila's cradle, one hand protectively on the baby's back. "Can't sleep either?" he asked softly. Eleanor turned, pulling her shawl tighter around her nightgown. "I told myself I was being silly, but..." "You're not silly. You're a mother protecting her child. That's pure instinct." Caleb moved to stand beside her, looking down at Mila's sleeping form. "How about I sleep out here tonight, on the floor by the fireplace, just in case?" "You don't have to do that." "I know, but I want to." He met her eyes in the dim light. "Let me do this, Eleanor. Let me be useful." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you." Caleb made himself a pallet near the fire while Eleanor returned to bed. He lay awake, listening to the night sounds, the coyotes gradually moving off to hunt elsewhere. Somewhere in the house, a board creaked. The fire popped and settled, and from Eleanor's room came the soft, steady breathing of her and Mila sleeping. This was his family, These sounds, these people, this fragile household perched on the edge of wilderness. The realization no longer felt strange or temporary. It felt like the truest thing he'd ever known. The next morning, Eleanor found him asleep on the floor, his rifle within easy reach. She stood in the doorway watching him for a moment, something tender crossing her face before she moved to start breakfast. The sound of her working in the kitchen woke him, and he sat up, stretching stiff muscles. "Coffee's ready," she said without turning around. "And I appreciate what you did last night. I slept better knowing you were there." "Any time." Caleb stood, folding the blankets. "In fact, maybe I should make this permanent. Sleep out here instead of in the back room. I'd hear if anything tried to get in, and you wouldn't have to worry." Eleanor paused in her work. "That would mean giving up your privacy, your own space." "Don't need much privacy, and the back room's tiny anyway. I'm always hitting my head on that low beam." He poured himself coffee. "Makes more sense this way." What he didn't say, what neither of them acknowledged directly, was that it also meant being closer to her and Mila, that the arrangement would blur the careful boundaries they'd maintained between their separate sleeping quarters. But Eleanor didn't object, and by that evening, Caleb had moved his few belongings to a corner of the main room. The new arrangement changed the rhythm of their household in subtle ways. Caleb was there when Mila woke for her night feedings, and he started taking the baby so Eleanor could sleep through at least one feeding each night, giving her the bottle of expressed milk Eleanor prepared. He was there in the early mornings when Eleanor emerged from her room, hair loose and eyes still soft with sleep. And Eleanor was there in the evenings when he returned from working the land, always with coffee ready and supper planned. They were living as a family in truth now, not just on paper. And somewhere in the daily intimacy of shared space and shared responsibility, something deeper began to grow. October brought the first frost and a crisis that tested everything they'd built. Caleb had been at the homestead for 5 days, racing against the weather to finish a root cellar before the ground froze solid. He was planning to stay 2 more days when Mr. Patterson arrived on horseback, his face grim. "It's your wife," Patterson said without preamble. "The baby's sick. Eleanor sent me to fetch you." Caleb's blood turned to ice. "How sick?" "Fever. Started yesterday morning. Eleanor's been trying to bring it down, but it's not breaking." Patterson was already turning his horse. "Doc Henderson's out of town. Won't be back until tomorrow. She needs you there." Caleb didn't bother packing. He threw his tools in the wagon, hitched up the horse, and drove through the afternoon and into the night, pushing harder than was wise on the rough terrain. By the time he reached the Garrett house, it was past midnight, and his horse was lathered with sweat. Eleanor met him at the door, Mila in her arms. Even in the lamplight, Caleb could see the baby's flushed cheeks and the way her small body seemed to radiate heat. "How long?" he asked, taking Mila gently. 36 hours. I've tried everything, cool cloths, keeping her hydrated, skin-to-skin contact to regulate her temperature. Nothing's working. Eleanor's voice was steady, but Caleb could see the fear in her eyes. "She's getting worse, Caleb. I don't know what else to do." Mila whimpered against his chest, her cry weak and pitiful. Caleb pressed his lips to her forehead. She was burning up, far hotter than any fever he'd experienced himself. At not quite 3 months old, her tiny body didn't have the reserves to fight illness the way an adult would. "The doctor won't be back until tomorrow?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not until late afternoon at the earliest. And Caleb," Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "I'm scared. She's so small and the fever's so high. I keep thinking about all the babies who die from things like this, and I can't lose her." Caleb pulled Eleanor against his side with his free arm, holding both of them. "We won't lose her. We'll fight this together." They spent the night in shifts, one holding Mila, while the other prepared cool compresses and tried to get water into her. The baby alternated between burning fever and terrifying periods of shaking chills. Her cries grew weaker as the hours passed, until she barely had the energy to whimper. Near dawn, Eleanor looked up from where she sat with Mila and said quietly, "We should prepare ourselves. In case she doesn't make it." "No." Caleb's response was immediate and fierce. "Don't say that. Don't even think it. We have to be realistic. Infant mortality is high, especially with fevers this severe. I've seen it before, Caleb. My youngest brother," her voice broke. He died of fever when he was 4 months old. One day he was fine, the next day gone. Sometimes there's nothing you can do. This is different. Why? Because we want it to be? Eleanor's eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. Because we saved her once? That doesn't make her immortal. She's a baby, and babies die. Sometimes love isn't enough. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow, partly because they echoed his own deepest fears. He'd grown up surrounded by death, children in the orphanage who succumbed to disease, men on cattle drives killed by accidents or exposure. He knew how fragile life was, how quickly it could be snatched away. But Mila was different. She had to be different. They'd fought too hard to keep her safe to lose her now to something as arbitrary as fever. Love might not be enough, he said, moving to sit beside Eleanor. But it's all we've got. So we keep fighting. We keep cooling her down, keeping her hydrated, and we don't give up, not for 1 second. Eleanor nodded, wiping her eyes. You're right. I'm sorry. I'm just exhausted and terrified. I know. Me too. As the sun rose, painting the room in soft gold light, they worked together with grim determination. Caleb held Mila while Eleanor prepared fresh compresses. Eleanor coaxed water into the baby's mouth, drop by drop, while Caleb sang rough lullabies he half remembered from somewhere in his forgotten childhood. By mid-morning, Mila's temperature seemed marginally lower. By noon, she'd managed to take a full feeding without immediately bringing it back up. And by early afternoon, when Dr. Henderson's wagon finally appeared on the road, the baby's fever had broken enough that she was sleeping naturally instead of the frightening stupor she'd been in. The doctor examined Mila thoroughly, asking detailed questions about the progression of symptoms and their treatments. Finally, he sat back with a satisfied nod. You two did everything right. Kept her cool, kept her hydrated, didn't panic and do something foolish. Another few hours of that fever and we might have lost her, but she's through the worst now. He looked between Caleb and Eleanor. She's a lucky child to have such devoted parents. After the doctor left, Eleanor collapsed into the rocking chair, all the strength she'd been holding onto suddenly gone. Caleb sat beside her with Mila, neither of them speaking for a long time. I really thought we might lose her, Eleanor said finally. When you weren't here, when I was alone with her getting sicker and sicker, I thought this was how it would end, that we'd saved her from the railroad tracks only to watch her die anyway. But we didn't. She's alive. Caleb adjusted the sleeping baby in his arms. We kept her alive, Eleanor. Together. Together, Eleanor repeated softly. She reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. I couldn't have done it alone. When you got here, when you held her and told me not to give up, that's what got me through, knowing I wasn't facing it by myself. Caleb squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses on her palm from household work, the strength in her grip despite her exhaustion. You're never by yourself. Not anymore. We're in this together, whatever comes. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, a wall coming down that Caleb hadn't even realized was there. This marriage, she said carefully, this arrangement we made, it's not feeling very arranged anymore, is it? No, Caleb admitted, it's not. When did that change? When did it become real? He thought about the question, tracing back through the weeks and months. I don't know if there was one moment. Maybe it's been happening all along, so gradually we didn't notice. Or maybe, he looked down at Mila. Maybe it was last night, when I thought we might lose her and realized I couldn't survive that loss. Not because she's the baby I saved, but because she's my daughter, mine and yours. Eleanor's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were different from the fearful ones she'd shed in the dark hours. She is ours, isn't she? Completely and truly ours. Yeah, she is. They sat together as the afternoon light faded, both too exhausted to move, both unwilling to break the moment. Mila slept peacefully between them, her breathing steady and her color finally returning to normal. And in the quiet of the old house, with autumn wind rattling the windows and the fire crackling in the hearth, their family solidified into something that felt permanent and unbreakable. The days following Mila's illness brought a new ease to their household. The crisis had burned away the last of their careful formality, leaving behind something more honest and comfortable. Caleb found himself telling Eleanor things he'd never shared with anyone. Stories from his childhood, fears about the future, dreams that seemed too fragile to speak aloud. And Eleanor reciprocated, opening up about her own past and the complicated relationship with her family that had driven her west. One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after putting Mila to bed, Eleanor said quietly, "I wrote to my mother, told her about you and Mila." Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending. "What did you say?" "The truth, that I married a good man who needed help saving a baby's life, that we're building a life together out here, that I'm happy." She smiled slightly. "I didn't mention that it started as a practical arrangement. Let her think it was a whirlwind romance." "And what did she say back?" "I don't know yet. The letter only went out last week, but whatever she says, it won't change anything. This is my life now, my choice." "No regrets?" Eleanor met his eyes directly. "About marrying you? About taking in Mila? Not for a single moment. Everything else we've lost, my teaching position, your solitary plans for the homestead, those were prices worth paying." Caleb set aside the harness and moved to sit beside her. "I need to tell you something." "About the homestead." "What about it?" "I've been thinking about the house I'm building out there. The plans I drew up before, they were for a bachelor, one man living alone. But that's not who I am anymore." He took her hand, feeling more nervous than he had on their wedding day. "I want to redraw them, make the house bigger, better. A real family home with room for all of us. Maybe even," he hesitated, "maybe even more children someday." Eleanor's breath caught. "More children?" "If you wanted. I know Mila's enough. I know you didn't sign up for—" "I'd like that," Eleanor interrupted, her voice soft but certain. "I'd like more children with you, Caleb. Not right away. We have enough on our plates with Mila and the homestead. But someday, yes. I'd like that very much." The admission hung between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. They'd moved from practical arrangement to genuine partnership, and now they were contemplating a real future together, not just surviving, but building, creating, growing. "There's something else," Caleb said, his heart hammering. "This marriage of ours. I know we said it was for Mila, for practicality, but Eleanor—" He turned to face her fully. "It's become more than that for me. You've become more than that. And I need to know if you feel it too, or if I'm alone in this." Eleanor's hand tightened on his. "You're not alone. I've been feeling it for weeks now, maybe longer, but I was afraid to say anything, afraid of pushing too fast or wanting too much." "What do you want?" She drew a shaky breath. "I want this to be real. Not just on paper, not just for appearances. I want to be your wife in truth, and I want you to be my husband. I want to build a life together that's ours by choice, not circumstance." Caleb felt something in his chest expand and release, like a door long locked finally swinging open. "I want that too, more than I've wanted anything." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Eleanor met him halfway. Their kiss was tentative at first, gentle and questioning, and then deeper as months of growing affection finally found expression. When they pulled apart, both were breathing harder and Eleanor's cheeks were flushed. "Well," she said with a shaky laugh, "that was long overdue," Caleb finished. She smiled, radiant in the firelight. "Yes, it was." That night marked a turning point in their marriage. They didn't rush into anything. Eleanor still slept in her room, Caleb still on his pallet by the fire. But the emotional distance between them had vanished completely. They touched more freely now, his hand on her shoulder as he passed, her fingers brushing his as she handed him coffee. And when they spoke of the future, it was with certainty rather than speculation. November brought early snow and the news that changed everything. Eleanor had gone into town for supplies, taking Mila with her while Caleb worked on winterizing the barn. When she returned, her face was pale and her hand shaking as she handed him a telegram. "It's from the land office," she said, "about your homestead claim." Caleb's stomach dropped as he unfolded the paper. He scanned the official language once, twice, not quite believing what he was reading. "They're challenging my claim, saying I haven't met the residency requirements because I've been living here instead of on the land." He looked up at Eleanor. "They're threatening to revoke it. Give the land to someone else. Can they do that? If I haven't lived on the property enough, yeah. The homestead law requires continuous residency and improvement. I've been doing the improvement work, but living here, he crushed the telegram in his fist. This is my fault. I should have been there more, should have prioritized the claim over comfort. You prioritized your family over land, Eleanor said firmly. There's no shame in that. There is if it costs us our future. That homestead was supposed to be our security, our foundation. Without it, what do we have? Eleanor took Mila from her carrying sling and settled her in the cradle before turning back to Caleb. We have each other. We have Mila. We have this house for at least a few more months. That's not nothing. It's not a permanent home, though. Come spring, we'll have to leave here. And then, where do we go? The question haunted them through the following weeks as Caleb made urgent trips to the land office, trying to sort out his claim. The bureaucrat behind the desk was unsympathetic. Rules were rules, and Caleb had failed to meet them. Unless he could prove continuous residency from this point forward, the claim would be revoked by spring. What if my family moved there now? Caleb asked desperately. Would that count? In winter? With an infant? The bureaucrat looked at him like he was insane. You'd never survive it. The cabin you've built isn't weatherproof enough, and you're too isolated. Come spring thaw, we'd find 3 frozen corpses. It was exactly what Caleb had feared, but hearing it stated so bluntly drove the reality home. He couldn't move his family to the homestead in winter, but staying at the Garrett place meant losing the claim. They were trapped, with no good options. When he returned home and explained the situation to Eleanor, she listened quietly, then surprised him by laughing, sharp and a bit wild. What's funny? He asked, confused. Nothing. Everything. She wiped her eyes. We saved Mila from certain death, survived scandal and loss of employment, lived through a terrifying illness, and now we're going to lose our land to bureaucratic rules. It's absurd. Eleanor, no, listen to me. She grabbed his hands. We've faced every challenge so far by refusing to accept defeat. When they said Mila should go to the orphanage, we fought it. When I lost my teaching position, we found another way. When Mila got sick, we didn't give up. Why should this be any different? Because I don't see a solution. We can't meet the residency requirement safely. Then we'll meet it unsafely. Eleanor's jaw set in determination. We'll move to the homestead. This winter, all 3 of us. You heard what the land office said. We wouldn't survive. We'll make sure we do. You said the cabin has walls and a roof, right? And there's a fireplace? Yes, but then we winterize it properly. Use what's left of your savings to buy supplies and materials. Work day and night if we have to, but make it livable. And then we move there. And we stay there, proving residency every single day until spring. Caleb stared at his wife, seeing the fierce determination in her eyes and recognizing it as the same quality that had made her risk everything to help him save Mila. She wasn't being reckless. She was refusing to surrender what they'd fought for. It would be hard, he said slowly. Harder than anything we've faced so far. Yes, but we'd be together, and we'd be fighting for our future, for Mila's future. Eleanor stepped closer. I'm not afraid of hard work, Caleb. I'm afraid of giving up without a fight. So tell me, are we going to let them take what's ours, or are we going to prove we deserve it? Looking at her standing there with firelight dancing in her hair and absolute certainty in her face, Caleb felt his own resolve strengthen. She was right. They'd overcome every obstacle so far by refusing to accept defeat. This would be no different. We'll need a lot of supplies, he said, and we'll have to work fast. Winter's already here. Eleanor smiled, fierce and bright. Then we'd better get started. The decision made, they moved with the focused urgency of soldiers preparing for battle. Caleb emptied what remained of his savings and bought lumber, nails, canvas, wool blankets, and enough food supplies to last through spring if necessary. Eleanor packed their belongings with ruthless efficiency, keeping only what was essential and selling or trading everything else. Mr. Patterson, hearing of their plans, donated a milk cow and showed up with his sons to help load the wagon. You're either very brave or very foolish, Patterson said as they worked. I can't decide which. Probably both, Caleb admitted, securing a crate of canned goods. But we don't have a choice. There's always a choice. You could let the claim go, find work in town, start over somewhere else. Eleanor appeared in the doorway with Mila bundled against the cold. And spend the rest of our lives wondering what we could have built if we'd been brave enough to try? No, thank you. We'll take our chances with winter. Patterson shook his head but smiled. You're well matched, you two. Stubborn as mules, both of you. They left the Garrett place on a gray December morning with snow threatening in the clouds overhead. The journey to the homestead took 3 days instead of the usual 2, the wagon heavy with supplies and the weather turning worse with each mile. Mila, now 4 months old, was wrapped in layers of wool and fur, tucked into a basket lined with heated stones that Eleanor replaced at every stop. When the homestead finally came into view, a small cabin perched on a windswept rise with nothing but prairie stretching to the horizon in every direction, Eleanor felt her determination waver for the first time. The isolation was absolute. The nearest neighbor was a full day's ride away. If something went wrong, if anyone got hurt or sick, they would be entirely on their own. Second thoughts? Caleb asked quietly, reading her expression. Eleanor looked at the cabin, then at Mila sleeping peacefully in her basket, then at her husband's weathered face. No, just first fears, but we'll face those together too. The cabin was rougher than Eleanor had imagined. One room, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a stone fireplace on one wall and gaps in the chinking that let in icy drafts. The roof was solid but uninsulated, and the single window had only oiled paper instead of glass. But Caleb had been right about one thing: the bones were good. With work, it could be made livable. They worked through the remaining daylight, Caleb installing a better door while Eleanor unpacked essentials and set up a corner for Mila. By nightfall, they had a fire going and hot food in their bellies, and they sat exhausted on the floor eating stew while Mila nursed contentedly in Eleanor's arms. First night in our new home, Eleanor said, looking around the primitive space. Not quite what I imagined when I married you. Caleb managed a tired laugh. Not quite what I imagined either. But it's ours. That counts for something. The first weeks were a test of endurance that pushed them all to the breaking point. Caleb worked from before dawn until after dark, sealing gaps, building furniture, improving everything he could to make the cabin more weatherproof. Eleanor managed the household, cooking on the fireplace, washing clothes in melted snow, and caring for Mila in conditions that grew harsher with each passing day. The temperature dropped steadily as December wore on. Some mornings they woke to frost on the inside walls and ice in the water bucket despite the fire burning all night. Mila seemed to sense the tension and became fussier, crying more than usual and sleeping in fitful bursts that left Eleanor exhausted. I can't keep her warm enough, Eleanor said one night, her voice tight with worry. No matter how many blankets I use or how close I keep her to the fire, she's always cold. Bring her into our bed, Caleb suggested. They'd been sharing the narrow bed more out of necessity than romance. 2 bodies generated more warmth than one, and they needed all the heat they could get. Between the 2 of us, she'll stay warmer. It worked. With Mila nestled between them and their combined body heat wrapping around her, the baby finally slept through most nights. But the arrangement meant Caleb and Eleanor were pressed close together, hyper-aware of each other's breathing, each other's warmth. One particularly cold night, Eleanor woke shivering despite the blankets and found Caleb already awake, watching her in the dim glow from the banked fire. You're freezing, he said, pulling her closer. Come here. Eleanor didn't resist, letting him tuck her against his chest with Mila safe between them. His body was furnace hot compared to hers, and she couldn't suppress a sigh of relief as warmth seeped into her bones. Better? He murmured against her hair. Much better. Thank you. They lay like that in the darkness, listening to Mila's soft breathing and the wind howling outside. After a long silence, Caleb spoke again. I'm sorry I brought you to this. You deserve better than a freezing shack in the middle of nowhere. Stop apologizing, Eleanor said firmly. I chose this. I knew what it would mean, and I chose it anyway. We both did. But what if I can't make it work? What if come spring the land won't produce, or we run out of money, or then we'll figure it out, together. She shifted to look up at him, their faces inches apart. Caleb, I didn't marry you for easy. I married you because you're a man who stops for crying babies on railroad tracks. Because you work until your hands bleed for people you care about. Because you refuse to give up even when everything's stacked against you. Those qualities matter more to me than comfort or security. Something shifted in his expression, raw emotion crossing his face. I love you, he said, the words rough and unpracticed. I didn't mean to, didn't plan for it, but I do. I love you, Eleanor. Eleanor felt her heart swell, tears pricking her eyes. I love you too. Have for weeks now, maybe longer. I was just too stubborn or scared to say it. He kissed her then, gentle despite the passion beneath it, mindful of the baby between them. When they pulled apart, both were breathing harder. When did this happen? Caleb asked wonderingly. When did we stop being strangers playing house and become this? I think it was always happening. We just finally caught up to it. Eleanor settled back against his chest. Now go to sleep. We have work tomorrow. But she was smiling in the darkness, and she felt Caleb's smile against her hair. They might be freezing in a primitive cabin in the dead of winter, but they had each other and they had love, and somehow that made everything else bearable. Christmas came without ceremony or celebration. They had no gifts to exchange, no special food to prepare. But Eleanor fashioned a small doll from scraps of fabric for Mila, and Caleb surprised them both by producing a small bag of horehound candy he'd hidden in his supplies. I bought it weeks ago, he admitted. Thought we might need something sweet to get us through the hard times. They each had one piece, savoring the simple pleasure, and gave Mila a tiny taste that made her face scrunch up comically. That night, sitting by the fire with their daughter between them, Eleanor felt a contentment she'd never experienced in more comfortable circumstances. This is enough, she said quietly. This moment, this life we're building. It's enough. Caleb pulled her close, kissing her temple. More than enough. It's everything. January brought the worst of winter and a blizzard that trapped them inside for 5 days straight. Snow piled so high against the door that Caleb had to dig them out each morning just to reach the barn to feed the animals. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid within minutes of being brought inside, and the wind drove through every crack in the walls with knife-edge precision. On the third day, Eleanor woke to find Mila burning with fever again. The terror of the previous illness came rushing back, compounded now by their complete isolation. They were 2 days' travel from the nearest doctor in good weather, and in this blizzard, leaving was impossible. No, Eleanor breathed, pressing her hand to Mila's too-hot forehead. Not again. Please, not again. Caleb was beside her in an instant, taking the baby while Eleanor's hands shook too badly to hold her. We beat this before. We'll beat it again. But as the fever climbed and Mila's cries grew weaker, Eleanor felt despair creeping in. This was her fault. She'd pushed for them to come here, to risk everything for a piece of land, and now her daughter was paying the price. She's going to die, Eleanor said flatly on the second day of fever. We're too far from help, and she's too small, and she's going to die because I was too proud to give up the homestead. Eleanor, don't. It's true. I convinced you to come here. I insisted we could make it work, and now our daughter is dying because of my stubbornness. Her voice broke on a sob. I killed her, Caleb. I killed our baby. Caleb grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. Mila is not dead. She's sick, but she's fighting, and we're going to help her fight, just like we did before. You didn't kill anyone. You're trying to save her, same as always. But what if it's not enough? Then we'll face that when it comes. But right now, in this moment, our daughter needs us to be strong. So we're going to cool her fever, keep her hydrated, and we're not going to give up. Do you understand me? Eleanor nodded numbly, letting him pull her into his arms. They held each other for a long moment, drawing strength from their shared fear and shared determination. Then they returned to Mila's care with renewed focus. For 2 days and nights they barely slept, working in shifts to keep the baby cool and hydrated. The blizzard continued to rage outside, sealing them in their small cabin with only firelight and desperation for company. Eleanor sang every lullaby she knew, her voice hoarse from overuse. Caleb told stories he half remembered from childhood, talking continuously just to fill the silence with something other than fear. On the morning of the third day, Mila's fever finally broke. Eleanor woke from a brief doze to find the baby sleeping naturally, her color better and her breathing steady. She touched Mila's forehead with a trembling hand and felt normal warmth instead of dangerous heat. "Caleb," she whispered. "Caleb, wake up." He jerked awake, immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Everything. The fever broke. She's sleeping normally." They stared at Mila in disbelief, almost afraid to hope. But as the minutes passed and the baby continued sleeping peacefully, relief washed over them in waves. Eleanor started crying, huge gasping sobs that shook her whole body. Caleb wrapped his arms around her, and she felt wetness on his cheeks too. "She's okay," Eleanor kept repeating. "She's going to be okay." "Yeah, she is." Caleb's voice was thick. "We did it. Again." When the blizzard finally ended 3 days later, they emerged from the cabin to find the world transformed. Snow lay in massive drifts that changed the entire landscape, and the sky was a brilliant cloudless blue that hurt to look at. Caleb dug a path to the barn while Eleanor stood in the doorway with Mila, breathing the sharp, clean air and feeling the sun on her face. "We survived," she said wonderingly. "All of us. We actually survived." That night, with Mila healthy and sleeping soundly, Caleb and Eleanor lay together in bed and let the tension of the past weeks finally drain away. Eleanor turned in his arms, studying his face in the firelight. "I meant what I said during the fever, about this being my fault for pushing us to come here." "Eleanor, let me finish. It was my fault we came, but I don't regret it. Even after everything, the cold, the fear, nearly losing Mila again, I don't regret it, because we proved something. We proved we could face the worst and come through together." Caleb brushed hair back from her face. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You know that?" "Not strong, just stubborn. There's a difference." "No, strong. You held this family together when I was ready to give up. You refused to surrender even when it would have been easier." He kissed her softly. "I'm in awe of you, Eleanor Turner." She smiled against his lips. "Well, I'm rather fond of you too, Caleb Turner." They made love that night for the first time since their wedding, a joining that was both tender and passionate, sealing their commitment with more than words. Afterwards, lying tangled together with Mila sleeping peacefully nearby, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness she'd never experienced before. This was her family. This was her home. Not because of the land or the cabin or any external measure, but because of the love that bound them together. February and March passed in a blur of hard work and small victories. The worst of winter loosened its grip, and with the slightly warmer weather came renewed energy. Caleb expanded the cabin, adding a second room and proper insulation. Eleanor started a garden in a sheltered spot, planning for spring planting. And Mila grew stronger every day, her personality emerging in smiles and babbling sounds that filled the cabin with joy. In early April, a rider appeared on the horizon, the first visitor they'd had in months. It turned out to be an official from the land office, come to verify Caleb's residency claim. The man inspected the property thoroughly, noting the improvements Caleb had made and questioning them both about their time on the homestead. Eleanor answered firmly, providing dates and details that proved continuous residency since early December. The official seemed surprised by her competence and clarity. "Most wives don't pay such close attention to these matters," he observed. "Most wives aren't partners in building a homestead from scratch," Eleanor replied coolly. "I'm as invested in this claim as my husband." The official made notes, examined the cabin one more time, and then surprised them both by smiling. "Well, Mr. and Mrs. Turner, I'm pleased to inform you that your claim is secure. You've more than met the residency and improvement requirements. The land is officially yours." After he left, Caleb picked Eleanor up and spun her around, both of them laughing with relief and triumph. They'd done it. Against all odds, through winter storms and illness and isolation, they'd held on to their land. "We should celebrate," Caleb said, setting her down. "Do something special." Eleanor thought for a moment, then smiled. "I know exactly what we should do." The next morning, they loaded the wagon with Mila and supplies for the day and made the journey to the railroad tracks where their story had begun. It had been nearly 10 months since that June morning when Caleb found a crying baby abandoned between the rails. They stood together on the spot where Mila had lain, Caleb holding their daughter while Eleanor stood close beside them. The baby was alert and happy, grabbing at Caleb's hat and babbling cheerfully. She had no memory of this place, no knowledge of how close she'd come to death here. "Someone left you here marked unwanted," Caleb said softly to Mila. "But you were never unwanted, not for a single day since I found you. You were loved before we even knew your name." Eleanor wrapped her arm around his waist, her other hand resting on Mila's back. "We didn't plan to be a family. We didn't choose each other the normal way. But we chose to fight for you, and in fighting for you, we found each other." A train whistle sounded in the distance, and they watched as the morning freight approached. The same line, possibly even the same train, that had thundered past all those months ago. But this time there was no baby on the tracks, no desperate race against time. There was only a family, whole and safe and together. As the train passed, Caleb turned to Eleanor. "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting more children someday." Eleanor's breath caught. "Yes? How would you feel about someday being now? Or soon, anyway, when you're ready?" She looked up at him, seeing the hope and love in his face, and felt her own heart expand with possibility. "I think I'd like that. A brother or sister for Mila. More life to fill our home." "More love," Caleb corrected, pulling her close. "That's what it really is. More love." They stood there as the train disappeared into the distance. Three people who'd been thrown together by chance and circumstance, but who'd chosen to become family. The wind swept across the prairie, carrying the scent of spring and new growth, and overhead the sky stretched vast and blue with promise. That evening, back at the homestead, Eleanor sat on the porch she'd helped Caleb build while he worked in the garden they'd planned together. Mila dozed in her lap, peaceful and secure. In the distance, she could see the fields Caleb would plant soon, land that would hopefully yield crops to sustain them through another year. It wasn't an easy life. It probably never would be. But it was theirs, built by their own hands and their own choices. And it was filled with a love that transformed everything, turned hardship into purpose, struggle into strength, and three separate people into an unbreakable whole. Caleb looked up from his work and saw her watching him. He smiled, that rare, full smile he saved for her, and Eleanor felt her heart overflow with gratitude for the path that had brought them here. She'd come west seeking freedom and found something better, belonging, purpose. A family not defined by blood but by choice, by sacrifice, by the daily decision to show up and love fiercely even when everything was difficult. As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Eleanor whispered to the sleeping baby in her arms, "You were never unwanted, sweet girl. You were always meant to be ours, and we were always meant to be yours." In the garden, Caleb stood and stretched, then walked toward the porch to join his family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The endless work of homesteading, the uncertainty of weather and crops, the thousand small struggles of building a life on the frontier. But tonight they were together, and they were home, and they were exactly where they belonged. The child once abandoned on railroad tracks was now the center of a family built on courage and love. And the two people who'd saved her had discovered that in choosing to rescue one small life, they'd also rescued themselves from loneliness, from fear, from the belief that they had to face the world alone. They'd proven that family wasn't about blood or convention or doing things the expected way. It was about who showed up when life got hard, who refused to walk away, who chose love over convenience, courage over comfort, and hope over despair. And as stars began to appear in the darkening sky over their Colorado homestead, three hearts beat in rhythm, mother, father, and daughter, bound together not by the circumstances that had brought them together, but by the conscious choice to build something beautiful from the broken pieces the world had given them. They were home, they were family, and they were finally and completely whole.